Okay, let's have a look at what we'll be doing this week here. Not all researchers view abnormal behavior in the same way, whether that's in the difference in explanation for cause of the disorder or treatment of the disorder. So in this video, we're going to look at and consider the current perspectives of abnormal behavior in terms of an explanation and theoretical perspectives. Let's begin with some current perspectives on abnormal behavior. Abnormal behavior may be viewed from various contemporary perspectives, and we'll begin with biological. The biological perspective incorporates the medical model, but also refers more broadly to approaches that relate to abnormal behavior, to biological processes, and applies a biological-based treatment. And we'll go through all of these ones through most of the course. The second one is psychological. The psychodynamic perspective reflects the view of Freud and his followers, who believe that the abnormal behaviors stem from psychological causes involving underlying psychic forces. Now, alternatively, learning theorists posit that the principles of learning can be used to explain both abnormal and normal behavior. The behavioral therapy is an outgrowth of learning model. And then the humanistic and existential theorists, they believe that it's important to understand the obstacles that people encounter as they strive towards self-actualization and authenticity, whereas cognitive theorists focus on the role of distorted and self-defeating thinking in explaining abnormal behavior, and these all fall under the psychological perspective. Now, when we move to the sociocultural perspective, sociocultural theorists believe that abnormal behavior is rooted in social ills, such as poverty, societal stress, institutionalized prejudice and discrimination, not in the individual. So not in the individuals, and it's not a social standard. Now, when we move to the interactional, today many theorists believe that multiple factors interact in a more complex way that are involved in the development of abnormal behavior patterns, and we'll explore this as well. Biological perspectives. This has had a huge impact on the growth of understanding psychological disorders. Big advances in genetics, epigenetics, and stem cell research. They've also considered the role of the nervous system in looking at psychological disorders. There's a stronger understanding of the biological systems in the patterns of abnormal behavior, particularly at the molecular level and the cell communication level. So when we consider genetics, that is how traits are passed from one generation to another generation that affects how well how we look, how we behave, and how we function is called hereditary, or a genetic process. The human genome, all the genetic material encoded in DNA, the molecular structure of the genome, comprises 4 basic organic compounds, A, T, C, and G. A is adenine, T is thiamine, C is cytosine, and G is guanine. Now there's 2.8 billion pairs, or thereabouts, and 20 to 25,000 genes. So we're fairly complex in our genetic components. It's not surprising there may be some flaws or some alterations that can affect abnormal behavior. Genetic errors, when the number or the sequence of the DNA pairs are in some way wrong, this could lead to bodily structures and functions to become abnormal or fail. Now, the epigenome, this is the molecular structure that overlays the genome and plays an important part in the gene regulation via the gene expression, or the gene expression is also known as turning on of some sort of gene material, and gene silencing, or the turning off. Epigenetics is providing insights into the origin of many and of many psychological disorders, as well as the course of many psychological disorders. Stem cells, these are the cells that can divide and develop into a diverse variety of more specialized cells and can self-renew and create more stem cells. These are just little wonders of the cell community. So many discoveries are being made and will continue to be made with the growth of epigenetics and stem cells. Now, as mentioned, we can also look at the development and the discoveries that we can determine in the nervous system. The nervous system is made up of nerve cells called neurons. They transmit or communicate to each other muscle movements, thoughts, writing, drawing, creativity, hallucinations, both audio and visual. They do a lot of things. Every neuron has a cell body, which is known as a soma. And it contains the nucleus and carries out the metabolic or life-sustaining functions of the neuron. The dendrites, these are projections out of the cell body that are the primary receivers of signals from the neurons. The axon is a tail-like extension of the neuron, and it transmits signals to other neurons. And so it's quite a network that you look at and when you consider the nervous system. At the ends of the axons are the axon terminals. Signals move from the axon terminals to the dendrites or the cell bodies to other neurons and to muscles, glands, and other parts of the bodies. The swellings are called knobs, occupy the tips of the terminals, and each neuron has a soma, dendrites, axon, terminal, and knobs. Neurons communicate with each other by means of chemical substances called neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters. The basics, when we talk about this, would be the synapse. This is the junction point between two neurons, one transmitting and the other receiving. Each neurotransmitter has a distinctive chemical structure that will fit in only one receptor site on a receiving neuron. It's kind of like puzzle pieces or a lock and a key. Any malfunctions or mistakes by the neurotransmitter in the brain can be linked to various mental health problems. Neurotransmitters are chemicals released into the sympathetic cleft from an axon terminal of a sending neuron. There's a variety of neurotransmitters. What are the functions of some of the major neurotransmitters? We'll go through them. Acetylcholine, or ACTH, is involved in learning, movement, and memory. It reduces the reduced levels of neurotransmitter acetylcholine is associated with Alzheimer's disease. Dopamine is another neurotransmitter, and it affects movement, attention, learning, reinforcement. Excessive levels of neurotransmitter dopamine appear to be involved in schizophrenia. Norepinephrine and epinephrine help regulate eating, metabolism, and alertness, and excesses or deficiencies of this neurotransmitter have been connected to mood disorders and eating disorders. A glutamate is in the brain, and it's the primary exciter neurotransmitter. Serotonin and GABA help us sleep, and while glutamate helps us stay awake. Serotonin is another neurotransmitter, and it's linked to anxiety disorders, mood disorders, sleep disorders, and even eating disorders. And then endomorphins are natural pain, endorphins, are the natural painkillers and contribute to a sense of pleasure and well-being. Now, if we look at the psychological perspective, in particular the psychodynamic models, Freud developed the psychoanalysis as a means of uncovering the unconscious, the conflicts dating back to childhood that he believed were at the root of mental disorders such as hysteria. Freud found that he could treat hysteria by tracing symptoms back to its root cause, often involved early relationships with parents. So some of his work, or a good chunk of his work, was around the structures of the mind. The unconscious, or these impulse and repressed primitive urges, The preconscious, the outside awareness, but is accessible by focusing attention, or the conscious, which is our awareness. Just the tip of the iceberg is just a very small part of that whole iceberg. Much of what we are aware of, wishes, impulses, fears, and urges, sources of our behavior, were beneath the surface, hidden and unconscious, as in terms of the unconscious mind. Now, Freud looked at what he called psychic structures of personality. He identified id, ego, and the superego. The id, it's a source of basal drives and impulses, hunger, thirst, sex, aggression, completely in the unconscious. Now, he identified the pleasure principle and the primary process thinking. The pleasure principle was instant gratification of instincts. Social norms, concern for others were not even considered. Whereas the primary process thinking, the id relates to the world of fantasy and imagination. Therefore, the id can meet its needs through creating mental images, daydreaming, dreams. Now, the ego, it's the conscious part of the brain, or more importantly, the conscious part of the mind. Present awareness and attempts to manage the id's influence with good sense. So the ego is kind of trying to keep a tab on the id. Therefore, the id can get its needs met, but not risk social disapproval. Ego is governed by the reality principle, what is practical and possible of the id's impulses and urges, and just expressing those. Secondary processing thinking is the executive function between the id and the realities of the outside world, and it aids in the development of a conscious sense of self. And then the third part, the superego, this is our moral selves. It's influenced from parenting and internalized through identification. The moral principle or our moral standards are essentially living here. Now, the ego fights a continual battle to stay on top of the id. Stay on top of the id and the superego. Occasionally, their conflicts produce anxiety that threaten to overwhelm the ego. The anxiety is the signal that alerts the ego to marshal its defense mechanisms, the unconscious protective processes that keep the primitive emotions associated with the conflict in check, so the ego can continue to coordinate reality. And what you're seeing here are some of what Freud would describe as defense mechanisms that would either be brought up as a way of coping, and some of these would translate into things that would be unhelpful. That he would almost say that they were sometimes adaptive and helpful, but sometimes they were maladaptive and unhelpful. Now, that's the psychodynamic psychoanalysis of Freud. Now, if we move into behavioralism, behavior therapy is an outgrowth of the learning model. The classical association of Pavlov's work that he did with dogs, where they associated food and salivating, and he could use that as a part of that learning, and it was called classical conditioning. Now, there's been many people involved in behaviorism. John Watson, he initiated an experiment to prove that fear could be classically conditioned, and in 1919 he did an experiment that was with, it's been since labeled as Little Albert. I'll post that video in week 1. He conditioned a small child, Albert, to be afraid of white rats and other white objects, and it's conditioned through association. So the tip of the iceberg here is looking at how might abnormal behaviors and psychological disorders be learned through classical learning techniques. Skinner, he did work in what are called operants, a type of learning in which the consequences of behavior are manipulated in order to increase or decrease the frequency of a response and shape an entirely new response. Now, he introduced some things called, and I think I can pull it up here for you, unconditioned response, unconditioned stimulus, conditioned stimulus, and unconditioned response. Now, the graphic there sort of gives you an idea, and I'm going to go through the descriptions of each of these to help you out. The unconditioned response, these are responses that is elicited by an unconditioned stimulus without prior learning. So things like salivation, a startle response, or contracting your pupils to light, or blinking, these are unconditioned responses. You don't learn them, they are things that are already there. The unconditioned stimulus, stimulus is what elicits a specific unconditioned response without any learning. So food produces salivation. So there's the unconditioned stimulus, food, and the unconditioned response, salivating. These are natural. These are things that are not learned. Now, if you move to the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response, the conditioned stimulus, a previously neutral stimulus, something that didn't cause any, effect, that eventually produced a conditioned response after being associated with an unconditioned stimulus, like a bell. And then the conditioned response is a learned response to a conditioned stimulus that occurs after that conditioned stimulus is paired with an unconditioned. So when you try to do this and look at the graphic, just look at it in terms of what is conditioned and what is unconditioned. Or in the case of the whistle, what is neutral. And I hope this makes some sense to you. Now, for example, if we were to say the word psychology, that's a conditioned stimulus, and pair it with a loud noise, unconditioned stimulus, if we do this enough times and repeat this pairing of saying the word and making the loud noise, slamming the textbook on the table, that we would associate the loud noise and it would become a conditioned response. This would not be unlike gaining phobias. Now, factors that can influence conditioning, the number of pairings. The more you pair and the more you train, the conditioned stimulus to the unconditioned stimulus can strengthen the response. The intensity of the unconditioned stimulus can have an impact. How reliable are the conditioned stimulus predicts the unconditioned stimulus. So the types of learning in which consequences of behavior are manipulated in order to increase or decrease the frequency of response, shape an entire new response, or to create as a reinforcer. Now you'll find this information on page 27. Alrighty, so here we are moving into reinforcers. Now, what's important in terms of the behavioralist perspective is that anything that follows a response and strengthens it increases the probability that it's going to reoccur. That if whatever follows the behavior, if you smile at me after I do something, and every time I do that you smile, that's a reinforcement. I'm going to increase the likelihood that I'll do that behavior. Positive reinforcement, any pleasant or desirable consequence that follows a response and increases the probability of that response being repeated. Now there's two types of primary reinforcers. There's two types of positive reinforcers. There's primary and secondary. Primary reinforcers are those things that fulfill basic physical needs for survival and don't depend on learning: food, water, sleep. Now secondary reinforcers, these are things that we get all the time. These are acquired or learned through an association with other reinforcers. We learn that money's important, so we see it as a positive reinforcer. It wasn't something that came by naturally or was unconditioned. Praise, applause, these are all secondary reinforcers. And Skinner introduced what he called shaping. It consists of gradual molding of desired behavior or the response by reinforcing any movement in the direction of desired response. And so you'd gradually learn a behavior. So when you learn how to write, you didn't do it all at once. You learned small gradual steps to become a more proficient writer. Successive approximations is what is referenced in shaping, a series of gradual steps, each of which is more similar to the final and desired response. Parents shape children by praising them each time they show an improvement. Circus animals learn different tricks through successive approximations. Pigeons learn to bowl and play a piano using successive approximations. Now when we consider humanistic psychology, Dr. Leslie Greenberg, he's a Canadian out of York University, and his work in emotion-focused therapy and emotional intelligence has helped understand another perspective about abnormal behavior. Essentially, if we handle, that is to say, experience and express our emotions in a healthy manner in coping with life, we're more likely to be happier and healthier. If we fail to do so, we risk our health. And in terms of health, we mean physical and emotional health. So it has a big impact in terms of how we think and feel related to our emotions, and the impact on our physical bodies as well as our emotional and intellectual capacities. To move to more of a cognitive perspective, social cognitive theory by Albert Bandura, learning by observing the behavior of others and the consequences of that behavior, we can learn what's known as vicariously. I don't need to touch the hot stove. If you've touched the hot stove, I can learn vicariously by watching you. This also involves imitation. Reciprocal determination is a term used in this theory on how our behavior both acts on and is influenced by our personal and environmental factors. So based on who I'm with or where I'm in terms of what room or around what people, that all can influence my learning. Not just the things that I do, but by virtue of people I'm with. Cognitive theorists focus on the role of distorted and self-defeating thinking in explaining abnormal behavior. If we move into another researcher in this area, Albert Ellis, he introduced what is known as REBT, or Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy. And it's an action-oriented psychotherapy that teaches individuals to identify and challenge, even replace their self-defeating thoughts and beliefs with healthier thoughts that promote emotional well-being and goal achievement. Another guy in this same area of cognitive behaviorism is Donald Mickelbaum. Now, Donald Mickelbaum, he is out of the University of Waterloo, and he developed what was known as cognitive behavior management, where essentially you create thoughts that create feelings, your feelings create behavior, and your behavior reinforces thought. So if you can adjust your feelings or adjust your thoughts or adjust your behaviors, you can change your reality of what you express and how you interact with the world. Now, moving on to the sociocultural. Sociocultural theorists, they believe that abnormal behavior is rooted in social ills such as poverty, societal stress, institutional prejudice and discrimination on not the individual. They believe that to eliminate abnormality, one must first correct the societal problems that cause it. Some sociocultural theorists argue that mental illness is a myth created to stigmatize people who do not conform to the prevailing social standards. Now, what was introduced by the sociocultural perspective was what's known as drift hypothesis, downward drift hypothesis. This is concerning the relationship between mental illness and social class. And the argument is that the illness causes one to have a downward shift in social class. The circumstances of one's social class does not cause the onset of a mental disorder, but rather an individual's disorientating mental health occurs as a result of being in a low social class. Moving into the interactionalist perspective, though, this is one that seems to bring everything together, if you will. No one theoretical perspective accounts for the complex forms of abnormal behavior. Many theorists today adopt an interactionist's perspective. They believe we need to take into account the action of multiple factors representing biological, psychological, sociological, and environmental domains in order to explain behavior. Now, one of the things that they introduced is what's known as a diathesis model. Today, many theorists believe that multiple factors interact in a complex way are involved in the development of abnormal behavior patterns. The leading interactionist model, the diathesis stress model, this posits that some people have a predisposition, this is also known as a diathesis, for pattern or for particular disorders, but whether these disorders actually develop depends on the type and severity of the stressors they experience. So two people can experience the same life stressors, but one develops a psychological disorder and another doesn't. It's essentially explained through this theory to say that one person, the person who develops the disorder, has a genetic vulnerability or a diathesis, that those life stressors built on top of that produces the disorder, whereas somebody who has not got the genetic vulnerability, who has the same life stressors, doesn't develop the psychological disorder. Now, I hope this hasn't been too confusing, but I hope it has shed some light that there's not a single one way to look at abnormal behavior and as to why does it exist? Why does one person have it and one person does not? It's much more complex, and it's much more interactive in regards to how some of these will overlap, and you'll find that some of the treatments do overlap when it comes to psychological disorders. All right, let's carry on, and we'll see you in week 2.